The moment I opened the front door and saw my wife sitting on the gravel driveway, shaking and bloodied, holding her wrist like it had been snapped in two, I knew something inside me had just shifted, something final, something cold. She wasn't crying. That was the worst part. Her lips were parted like she wanted to speak, but no words came, just the sound of her breath trying to stay steady. And behind her, still parked at the edge of my private ranch road, were two HOA enforcers, clipboard warriors turned amateur sheriffs, casually sipping from coffee cups like they hadn't just put their hands on a woman who once ran triage in a trauma ward overseas. That's the moment I stopped being the calm man everyone in the county courthouse knew and started becoming something else entirely. But to understand how we got to this point, how the HOA turned a petty grievance into an outright war and unknowingly targeted the one man in the entire county they absolutely should have left alone, we have to back up 3 weeks to the first time I saw the white truck parked at the edge of my property, half hidden by the trees and angled just enough to look like it belonged to someone who didn't know what boundaries were. At first, I chalked it up to hikers. This part of the mountain gets the occasional lost couple looking for trails Google Maps made up. But then I noticed the same truck parked there again the next morning, this time with binoculars on the dash and an HOA magnet slapped on the side like a war banner. I should have known then it wasn't a one-time thing. Still, I let it go. I had a judge's docket stacked with real problems, not weekend neighborhood cosplay. My wife, Dana, warned me. She said the HOA had changed ever since the new, compliance chairwoman, moved in 2 cabins down. Apparently, she brought in private enforcers to tame the wild elements on the mountain, and our lake cabin, with its solar panels, horse stables, and wind chimes Dana liked to hang from the porch, was just too much freedom for their cardboard kingdom. I wasn't worried. I should have been. The next incident came with a knock. Not from the door, but from the sound of something hitting our mailbox. A full-blown metal clipboard was hurled at it, hard enough to dent the aluminum and leave paperwork scattered like confetti across the gravel. Dana picked it up. Violation notices. Infractions for things like unapproved structures and non-regulation fencing, which was rich, considering I built that fence with reclaimed timber from the land I personally rezoned. That should have ended it. I sent a formal letter, with all the attached property deeds and exemption clauses signed, ironically, by myself. They ignored it. They escalated. Next came the drone. Dana heard the whirring before she saw it. She was out feeding the horses when it swooped down, buzzing like a wasp over her head. She waved it off, then threw a rake at it, and the drone crash-landed in our duck pond. That's when I filed a report, not as a neighbor, but as a judge. I made it official. But HOA Karen, as Dana had started calling the chairwoman, didn't get the message. I got the feeling she didn't even Google who she was messing with. Then, 2 days later, while I was at court overseeing a property dispute between 2 farmers, Dana called me from the emergency room. That's when everything changed. According to the nurses, 2 HOA compliance officers showed up at the cabin mid-morning while Dana was alone. They didn't knock. They claimed they were following up on a non-conforming structure on the south fence, referring to a chicken coop Dana had painted with our niece. When she told them they had no jurisdiction and to leave the property, one of them pushed her into the gatepost. Another grabbed her phone and tossed it into the bushes. She screamed. They left before the sheriff arrived, but not before making sure she was on the ground, bruised and bleeding. I never drove faster in my life, and as I pulled up and saw her sitting there, refusing a stretcher, with her pride cracked but unbroken, I realized that the lines had been redrawn. This was no longer about fences or zoning or bylaws. This was about power. This was about someone mistaking silence for weakness and peace for permission. They didn't know who I was. That wasn't arrogance. That was fact. They didn't know I'd authored 3 of the ordinances they tried to cite against me. They didn't know I had the legal rights to not just this cabin, but the entire ridge, every acre from the waterline to the transmission towers. They didn't know I kept copies of every HOA meeting transcript going back 10 years, and that I knew which board members had unpaid county taxes or unresolved dispute. They didn't know Dana had once worked in war zones and knew how to keep records of everything, even while in pain. They thought they could play cowboy on my land. So I decided it was time to teach them the difference between authority and theater. I called a meeting. Not with them, of course. They wouldn't have shown up. I called the sheriff, the county clerk, the mayor's liaison, and the chair of the zoning board. We met on my back porch, overlooking the lake. I brought coffee. Dana brought evidence. And together, we began the slow, precise process of dismantling everything the HOA thought it controlled. Quietly, legally, publicly. They'd assaulted the wrong woman, on the wrong property, married to the wrong man. And by the time they realized what was happening, it would already be too late. The first time I met the so-called enforcers face to face, it wasn't in a courtroom, but at a town breakfast fundraiser at the firehouse, where irony and pancakes were served in equal portions. They strolled in wearing tactical vests like they were preparing to breach a meth lab, not babysit garbage bins and mailbox colors. One of them, a lanky man with a chin that seemed to retreat with every word he said, locked eyes with me and didn't blink. The other one, stockier with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses still on indoors, gave me a smug nod as if he had something over me. I stayed seated. I sipped my coffee, and I watched them make the rounds, casually letting their presence linger like a bad odor. They weren't HOA employees in any official sense. They were private hires, sent in by Karen to enforce compliance with bylaws that had never passed a legal review. Their badges were fake, their paperwork was laughable, and their confidence came from the fact that most people didn't know any better. But I did. After Dana was assaulted, I had pulled every thread of authority they claimed and found it all unraveling into one massive, sloppy, illegal overreach. The compliance firm they were contracted through was unlicensed. Their right to enter property was void under state statute. And their presence on my land, especially given the altercation, was not just trespassing. It was actionable battery. But I didn't confront them there, not yet. Because timing, like evidence, is everything. So I waited. I let them dig. And dig they did. They posted a new set of violations on my gate a day later. This time taped with duct tape like a ransom note. Dana found them and laughed out loud, despite her arm being in a sling. Violation 4: Unauthorized livestock interaction, she read, then looked over at the goats sunbathing in the dirt like retired yoga instructors. What does that even mean? I shrugged and made a note. A minute later, she handed me another notice, this one accusing us of causing visual disruption to community cohesion, which we decided must have been about the scarecrow we put up wearing a bathrobe and holding a sign that said, "Don't make me call the judge." It was petty. It was escalating. And it was exactly the kind of thing I needed them to keep doing. Because while they kept violating us with imaginary authority, I was building a file thick enough to make their entire operation collapse. I already had the sheriff on board. He'd known me since I started as a junior attorney and respected Dana like family. He even came by the house off-duty, just to make sure she was okay. When he heard the details, his face went dark. They never filed any security permits, he told me, arms crossed. This whole thing smells off. You want them gone? I said no. Not yet. I wanted them documented. I wanted them confident. I wanted them to think they were winning. Because while they were parading around with plastic radios and fake citations, I was preparing a cease and desist order backed by civil code, criminal statute, and an emergency injunction drafted so tightly it could legally pin their enforcer vests to the wall. The next time I saw HOA Karen was during her grand community speech, which she held on the gazebo lawn next to the artificial pond she'd spent 6 months trying to rebrand as the HOA Memorial Wetlands. It was basically a ditch with cattails, but you had to admire her dedication to fiction. She was in full performance mode, mic clipped to her lapel, arms spread wide, talking about the importance of order and the dangers of unregulated spaces and non-compliant neighbors who threaten our shared vision. And right on cue, she looked in my direction. Smiled. Didn't say my name, but everyone knew. I waved. I even clapped when she was done. I figured if we were going to do this publicly, we might as well enjoy the theater. What she didn't know was that, while she was preaching about order, her enforcers were currently under surveillance. Not by me, by the county investigator I'd brought in from 2 towns over, who was filming them tailgating on public property and trying to pressure a widowed retiree into repainting her garage door. When I got the footage, I sat down with Dana and we watched it together. "How much longer do you need?" she asked, her tone cool and measured. "Not much," I said. "They're about to cross a line even they can't talk their way out of." That line came on a Thursday. The enforcers showed up again, this time with a notice nailed directly into one of our trees. Not a posted notice. Nailed. 100-year-old pine, damaged just to send a message. Dana stood in front of it, one hand on her hip, the other clutching her phone. "Smile," she said, taking a picture. "We're going to frame this next to the court summons." It was the final straw. The tree was on county-recognized heritage land. Protected. Tampering with it was a finable offense, but the part that sealed their fate was that I'd already filed a temporary protection order on the property. And now I had visual proof of violation. I printed the photos, attached them to the investigator's report, and dropped the entire packet on the mayor's desk with a note that said, "It's time." That same afternoon, I sent a certified letter to HOA Karen. It was civil in tone but legally brutal in content. It outlined every infraction, every false notice, every act of intimidation. It included a warning that continued trespass would result in full civil litigation under my personal counsel. And then, for good measure, I included a copy to every board member, the sheriff's department, the zoning commission, and the local paper. I didn't ask for a meeting. I didn't ask for apology. I gave them facts, and then I waited. Because the moment you hit bullies with law, silence usually follows. But Karen? She wasn't done. Not yet. Instead of retreating, she doubled down. The next morning, Dana woke up to a voicemail from a blocked number. A man's voice, vaguely threatening, saying we should think twice before embarrassing people with power. I ran the audio through a trace. It matched one of the enforcers. And that's when I decided this wouldn't just be about defending our land anymore. This was now personal. And I was going to make sure the courtroom was the last place any of them wanted to see again. The voicemail was still playing in Dana's hand when I stepped out of the shower, my hair dripping, towel slung over my shoulder, and the way her face looked, frozen, pale, lips slightly parted like she was trying to process whether what she heard was real or just paranoia bubbling over, made my stomach twist tighter than anything the courthouse ever threw at me. The voice was male, muffled, probably recorded on a cheap burner, but not distorted enough to hide the bravado in it, the sleazy threat buried under fake calm. He said things like, "Don't think the judge title makes you untouchable," and embarrassing people who know where you live isn't smart. And then came the most chilling part, said so casually I nearly dropped the phone when she replayed it for me. "Next time, we knock before we push." That wasn't just a warning. That was a reference to what happened to Dana at the gate. That was a confession, slipped into intimidation. He thought he was clever. He thought he'd scare us into silence. Instead, he handed me everything I needed. I didn't waste time. By noon, I'd submitted the recording, a sworn affidavit, and the matched vocal signature to the district attorney's office with a formal request to open an investigation into targeted harassment, trespassing, and assault tied to a non-licensed private enforcement body operating under false HOA authority. Normally, that process would take weeks. But I was no normal petitioner. I was the county judge who sat on the very bench the DA's staff walked past every Monday. And while I made sure to follow every ethical line, I didn't need to bend rules to expose what was already rotting from the inside out. My legal assistant, Maggie, pulled every piece of documentation from my previous rulings related to property law, enforcement jurisdiction, and abuse of authority.